This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thank everybody for coming. It's a very great pleasure to introduce Fiona Candlin from Birkbeck, Senior Lecturer in Museum Studies, and also Steph from the Bishopsgate Institute. I don't know what your title is these days.
Head of everything.
Changes, depending on who
Changes.
you ask. Yeah, Library and Archives Manager.
Library and Archives Manager at the Bishopsgate Institute. And we'll be talking about micromuseums and archives. So I think we're going to do some talking and then some discussing. So that's the kind of format.
Okay, thank you. Over the last 8 months, Steph and I have worked together on setting up a micromuseums archive at the Bishopsgate Institute. The initial material for the archive and the premise of it, micromuseums, came out of the research that I did for my new book, which is called Micromuseology, and which has just come out, so I'm very proud of it. So you've got a picture of it, and you'll have to order it for libraries. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to outline the Micromuseology project and describe how the archive came about, and then we'll pass over to and why I think it's worth doing, and then I'll pass over to Steph and he's going to talk about it from his perspective. So the project itself, the Micromuseology project, you probably know that in the late 20th century the number of museums worldwide went up massively. So in the UK it more than quadrupled, and it rose from around about 600 in 1970 to 2,500 by 1990. So you've got 1,900 museums open in 20 years just in the UK. Now, like the museums that were opening up across Europe and in America, these new museums had three distinct characteristics. So they were small, which is loosely defined as being run by 3 or fewer paid members of staff. They were independent in that they operate without core funding from the state, and that they concentrate on single, narrowly defined subjects. Now, I'd also add to that they're usually what I'd call DIY museums, in the sense that they're established by people from outside the museum profession. So they tend to be set up by community groups or by special interest groups, less often by businesses, quite often by individuals and their families. So you've got independent, small, single subject museums run by people who aren't museum professionals, and I loosely refer to that category as micromuseums, partly because it just saves an awful lot of qualifying terms. So some examples of that would be, and maybe this would be a moment to have the lights off if that's okay. So this is the Museum of Knots. Knots and Sailors Rope Work, which is one of my particular favourites. It's in Ipswich. This is Internal Fire Museum of Power, which is a collection of early 20th century diesel engines in Ceredigion. Colbost Croft Museum up on Skye. I particularly like the ticket office, which is made from an old rowing boat. Blandford Shell Museum in Norfolk, and the Dad's Army Museum. So you get some sense of the kinds of places that I'm working on. I think we're all right to have the lights back on now. I'm sorry about making you jump up and down. Now, this massive rise in the number of museums was acknowledged to be an important cultural phenomena. So the historian Raphael Samuel wrote that one of the most, and this is a quote, one of the most remarkable additions to the ranks of Britain's memory keepers would be the multiplication of do-it-yourself curators and mini-museums. And the museums expert Kenneth Hudson put the case even more strongly when he wrote that the new museums, quote, constituted a revolution, the word is not an exaggeration, in museum philosophy and its practical application. So they were very much seen as completely overturning what had been regular practice within the museum service. Now, I'd certainly agree that they did transform the sector, but it was very noticeable that they actually have attracted very little scholarly or professional attention. So during the heritage debates in the 80s and 90s, which some of you might be familiar with, I mean, Robert Hewson is probably the best known of, he wrote The Heritage Industry. Commentators at the time tended to treat them as symptomatic of cultural trends. So they saw the growing number of museums as evidence of deindustrialisation, of Thatcherism, of a growing rise in nostalgia. Even Raphael Samuel, who was very sympathetic to the increase in museums and what it represented, he saw them as evidence of the growing democratisation of history, and he approved of them. But all of these commentators, including Raphael Samuel, they treated these museums as symptomatic. They didn't actually look at individual museums in any detail. If they did, on the rare occasions they did, they looked at the atypically big ones, so places like the Beamish or Ironbridge. And there was actually very few of those kinds of museums. In fact, Beamish, Ironbridge and Wigan Pier probably were about it. So you had about 1,900 tiny museums and 3 biggish ones, and it was the 3 big ones that got the attention. More recently, since then, you've had scholars who have written about small museums in post-colonial situations, but they're always community museums. And you've had a few scholars that have already also examined micromuseums in the West, but always in relation to themes of community. So when the discussion is about curation or architecture or the idea of the museum, these kinds of places never get mentioned. It's there's very, very little written on them, a handful of pieces. And so the implication of that is very much that cultural innovation and the production of knowledge only occurs in public sector institutions or in the large, wealthy, independent museums. So for me, the question was, and what I wanted to know is, would studying these small museums really revolutionise museum philosophy, as Hudson said, and if so, how? Or to put it in slightly less dramatic terms, would researching the Southport Lawnmower Museum instead of, say, the Louvre or the British Museum be a way of testing and refining and expanding the discipline? Would focusing on these kinds of places help generate new perspectives on current debates within museum and heritage studies? And would they enable researchers to reconceive ideas of curation or of collections or the public, what it means to visit a museum, or the kinds of knowledge that's generated in them? So that was very much my kind of brief setting off the project. Addressing those questions took some time, but I finished the book about a year ago and it came out a couple of weeks ago. And I'll just say something briefly about the form the book takes. So the introduction begins with the methods and definitions of small, independent and museums, because those categories aren't all that straightforward. And then there's a series of chapters that looks at 1 or 2 micromuseums in detail for each chapter. Now, one of the things that happens with studies of museums is that generally academics look at one aspect of the museum. So they'll write about the architecture, or they'll write about the collection or the curation. They don't tend to join those things together. And what I tried to do with this book is to think about where the museums were located, what surrounded them, what was going on outside of them as well as inside the museum, what kind of buildings they were in, who ran them, what the displays were like, what the labelling was like, and try to think about how those things connected up. So I argued that it mattered if you approached a museum by walking down a little country road in Cornwall and arrived next to a harbour. You know, that made a massive difference to if you had to walk across a dual carriageway in Belfast. And it meant that you understood the collections differently. And the same with the actual accommodation. It matters if something's in a garage or an old church hall. The other thing that I did is I wrote about the curators. So visiting major museums is often quite standardised. I mean, we might disagree about the quality of the exhibition or whether or not we're interested in it, but actually visiting is going to be pretty much the same. It doesn't make too much difference what day you go on, apart from maybe the crowds are a bit bigger or a bit less. That's not true of small museums, where you quite often meet the people that run them, and how they respond depends on who you are, and often just on the circumstances of the day. So that when I visited some of these places, some of the curators were rather disappointed that I wasn't an enthusiast, and the fact that I didn't know about railway landscape modelling, they clearly were quite disappointed. On other occasions, they were quite impressed I was writing a book. In some cases, they were quite worried that I was travelling around the country by myself in a camper van and mainly wanted to know how I fed myself. And all of this made a difference to what happened in visiting those places. Sometimes you meet visitors, and the conversations that take place, it's not just you and the curators, it's who else is there as well. So I included all the description of those kinds of things in the book, and about the contingency of museum visiting, how it's not stable. So the writing very much aimed at this kind of rich description, but in order to address my initial questions, I needed to show how those factors impacted on current debates in museum studies. So each chapter also considered a specific theme. I wrote about things like I wrote about the Vintage Wireless Museum in Dulwich and how that interrupts received wisdom on the idea of the public status of museums. I looked at the Museum of Witchcraft, and I argued against the idea that museums disconnect objects from their original circuits of use, and that renders them dead, and visitors don't have the same kind of emotional or spiritual reactions to them. I looked at the Lurgan History Museum, which is a collection of Irish Republican artefacts, and argued against the current orthodoxy that multi-perspectival exhibitions are a good thing. I was advocating partisan exhibitions. I looked at philanthropy in relation to the British and India Museum, where everything's been given. That's something that's not really talked about in museum studies, but it's very, very common in these places for a lot of their holdings to be gifts. And a lot of this stuff isn't valuable. So I was interested in why people were giving this stuff and why museums were keeping it. And what they thought the museum was that they would hand over these objects. And then the final chapter of that section was about the Bakelite Museum and how cluttered it is, and how also that runs against the common idea that museums have less objects now and that having multiple objects is bad practice, and argued that actually museum studies needed to become more cluttered, it needed to become more messy. So generally I was trying to show how the study of micromuseums can offer alternative perspectives on some quite standard areas of museological inquiry. And then there's a long chapter where I look at distinct characteristics of micromuseums. I looked at about 60 museums and things like their display techniques and staff and so on. So, I'm pleased with the book and I think it works well, but my decision to take this approach, and in some ways this is where it starts to relate into the archive, was partly due to a lack of available information on micromuseums. There's very little on record about them. So I'll say a bit about that and about how it affected my work and then how that led into the museums. So basically there's no... I sort of knew this when I was starting at the project, but I didn't quite grasp what a big deal it was. There's basically no authoritative resource on independent museums, never mind small museums. So the Arts Council only keeps lists of museums that are accredited, which is probably about 2/3 of museums in the UK. But what also becomes very clear is that we don't actually know how many museums there are in the UK. You're always dealing with very approximate numbers. The Association of Independent Museums, and I should say that a lot of the small museums aren't accredited, they don't reach professional standards, so they don't appear in any Arts Council lists. A similar situation is true of the Association of Independent Museums, because their Their lists are of members, and you've got to have a reasonable level of professionalism to become a member, and the available funds, you've got to pay for it. So smaller museums tend to fall off their lists as well. The best register of museums in this country is the Museums Association Yearbook, but that relies on organisations submitting their own details. So again, somewhere small or quite amateur or community run may not even know about the museum's yearbook, never mind get round submitting information on it. So you don't have any kind of nice authoritative list. It's also rare for micromuseums to have their own archives and to document their own histories. So, the Museum of Witchcraft, which is one of the most commercially successful micromuseums in the UK, does keep files of correspondence pertaining to the museum, but these are pretty much uncatalogued. And they're pretty patchy, partly because of the floods that happened about 10 years ago, but partly because people hadn't thought it that important to keep them. One of the only places that had very solid records was the British and India Museum. Oh, that's the Bakelite Museum, which I forgot to show you. That's the archive at the British and India Museum. And the guy that set this up kept scrapbooks of all the correspondence. So there are these letters there that date back to the late 60s. And I use that material in the chapter on philanthropy because it's pretty much the only instance I've come across where somebody's kept a complete record of correspondence with donors. But a lot of the really small museums don't even have a website, never mind, a proper archive. Now, this lack of centralised record keeping of the museum archives limited the kind of research that I could do, or the questions I could ask, and as it would for anybody. Because if you don't have that kind of overview information, you can't make any broad claims about the subject or do any kind of quantitative analysis. So you can't, for instance, compare the numbers of toy museums with those on religion. You can't look at those that are run by guilds as opposed to enthusiasts. You can't look at the geographical distribution of museums. You couldn't work out how many museums are to do with industries that have fallen out of use compared to those that are currently viable. Or work out whether museums of vacuum cleaners predate those of dolls. You can't do any of that broad comparative stuff. But also without the individual museum archives, you can't write any sort of institutional biography or do any detailed history of the museums. So to some degree, my book, Micromuseology, was a bit of a negotiation about what kinds of work it was possible to do about these places. But having finished it and having realised quite the limits of the available information, which I spent a long time somehow thinking that there was more stuff out there and that it was just that I hadn't quite found it yet, I started planning a new project called Mapping Museums, which is enormously ambitious and is going to require a great deal of grant funding, which I may never get. But the idea of it is to start addressing that situation and to collate all the available data on independent museums and then research what isn't there in order to try and set up some kind of database of what's happened within the independent museum sector over the past 50 years during this period of expansion. And that would hopefully allow me to address some of the questions that I couldn't do with this last book. In the end, about this time last year, I started running a pilot study on that, which went through into the beginning of this year. And in the course of doing that, I realised that I was moving away from museology and very much more into cultural history. And I'm not a historian by training, so I decided I wanted to run it past somebody who I thought I could trust their judgment on it and who was in my view, a proper historian. And so I went to see one of my colleagues, Matt Cook, who is a professor of history at Birkbeck, but is also director of the Raphael Samuel History Centre. And he got quite excited both about micromuseology and about the mapping project, because he saw it as basically being one of the first sustained projects to pick up on the kinds of ideas that Raphael Samuel was writing about in his last book, Theatres of Memory. And I kind of knew that, but I hadn't quite clocked it. So he got excited about that in the connection with Raphael Samuel's work, and he said I should go and talk to Steph at the Bishopsgate Institute Library and Archive, because they hold Raphael Samuel's papers, and they also have specialist archives in grassroots cultural activities and groups. So there was a definite crossover with the micromuseums. We met, and Stefan suggested that we collaborate on an archive. Now, precisely because there's so little information available, as I'd travelled around the UK looking at all these different museums, I'd pretty much collected anything I could get my hands on about small museums. So I had quite a lot of leaflets, flyers, some DVDs, self-published books on it, and I'd amassed this stuff. And that went to Bishopsgate to start the archive, and since then we've been trying to develop that, and various museums have begun giving us things. The plan is very much is any future work that I do on this subject will also get passed over to the archive. So Steph is going to be burdened with years of my research.
I'm quite happy.
How are we doing for time? I was going to say a bit about why I think it's important, but are we okay? Another 5 minutes, and then I'll pass over to Steph. So, working on the project on micromuseology, that's some of the material that I handed over. Just knock the light off for a second so you can see the slide for me. So I think you've really got to look at the cat pottery leaflet there. That's one of my particular favourites. And the Gordon Boswell Romany Museum DVD. That's a lawnmower museum postcard at the top that I can see. So yeah, I mean, this is just some of the more recent stuff that I brought in.
There's a museum of cat pottery.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that in someone's house?
No, I haven't been to that one actually, so I don't know.
Okay.
North Wales.
Yeah.
Where's that?
It's Norfolk.
Oh, no.
All the maddest museums are in Norfolk. Sorry,
from Norfolk.
but they are. They really are. Do you want to just put that back up? Sorry, thank you. So yeah, the more I worked on it, the more I realised how little information was kept on these places. Now, that's an issue because micromuseums tend to have very short lifespans, and when they close, they often leave no they haven't got much of a trace in the public record when they're open, so you can imagine when they're closed, there's virtually nothing. And their collections tend to be sold off or just junked. They don't move into other more institutionally solid venues. So I think it's important to have somewhere where you can at least begin to document them, that they existed. And I think that's important for several reasons. I mean, Raphael Samuel argued that they represented a growing popular interest in history, and I'm not quite sure that's actually bang on. But I do agree with Samuel that what they represent is a massive shift in cultural sensibility, where people start setting up their own museums, where you see this move from museums being something that are almost exclusively professional to something which actually the majority of museums are now run by people who aren't trained, and many of whom are volunteers. And they tell the stories that matter to them in their own style, which isn't that of major museums. And I think it's important to record that grassroots museum practice, because if we don't, it's very easy to assume that museums are all institutions and they're all run by people with lots of qualifications in those areas, that they've got particular kinds of standards, even things like proper security and so on. I also think it's important to document them, because micromuseums often have artefacts and recount histories that don't have any kind of counterpart in major museums. So, and it's often difficult to imagine any circumstances in which they would end up in major museums. So, as far as I know, there aren't any Romany caravans in a major museum. And given that travellers aren't generally represented and there's almost no coverage of English folk art in major institutions, it's very doubtful that they're ever going to get shown soon. This is an amazing place, this collection of stuff. And equally, this is the Peter Cook, I always get the pronunciation wrong, shell gallery, where there are these completely baroque sculptures made out of shells. These are never going to end up in a major museum, but equally things like the puppet dolls from the Museum of Witchcraft Museum wouldn't, and a lot of the stuff it's partly the kinds of thing, it's partly what's said about these kinds of artefacts, but often it's also the artefacts themselves, and there's a lot of objects that you find where it'd be too contentious to show them in a mainstream gallery. I was particularly freaked by the spells which have been written onto communion wafers at the Witchcraft Museum, and I can't really imagine many museums being very happy with showing that kind of thing. Or equally the Irish Republican Museum. So this is an Irish flag that has been signed by people that were jailed for terrorist offences, because the museum very much operates as a kind of meeting place and almost like a pilgrimage site for people who were active Republicans, active in the armed Republican struggle to differentiate. So these sorts of museums offer, whether or not you like them, these museums offer a kind of counter history. They're telling stories that you're not going to find elsewhere. I think the other reason why it might be important to document them, and this is something that I need to research further and would be part of the mapping museum project, and I can't prove it at the moment, but I think it's the case, is that I think micromuseums articulate the concerns of very specific groups in particular places at particular times. So they're not just eccentric little venues, or they're not kind of nostalgically obsessed by the past, as the heritage debate has often thought, but they're these very localised and subjective responses to political and cultural change. So for instance, it's noticeable that most of the transport museums open up around the time you get the deregulation of the transport systems. That you get agriculture museums, rural life museums at the point that agriculture is being industrialised, that shipping museums open as the fishing industry collapses. These places are responding to that, to those changes, and tracking them might be a way of being able to map national and international change, but at a very localised grassroots level. So I think they're important for that. And then just to close, I think it's important to open an archive around them now, because a lot of these museums are under particular threat of closure. I mean, they often hang on by a fingernail, but particularly at the moment, because the people that set them up in the 70s and 80s are all retiring or dying, and they don't necessarily have successors. And there are some museums that aren't so reliant on the founders, but they're reliant on volunteers who are often, I go to places where the youngest volunteers are in their 70s. Now that isn't carrying on because that generation retired early on good incomes. Now that's not going to be the same for me. I'm going to be working till I fall over. And people don't have the time to go and put hours and hours into a local museum every week. So there's a real issue about the workforce. There's an issue about recession because it's hit the tourist spend, so that a lot of these places that were making very good money in the 80s and kind of in the 90s in the last few years are really suffering. And the other thing, slightly obliquely to hit a lot of them, is particularly the family-run museums often supplemented income by dealing in whatever artefacts they sold. So you would often, like say the Tank Museum in Cobberton had a sideline in selling tanks to rich city kids and the children of minor aristocracy. And apparently the market's just gone out of the private tanks. But equally, a lot of these people dealt in antiques on the side. So it might not be their thing, but they'd be doing antiques trading, particularly in the winter months, to keep money coming in. And the antiques market pretty much started to nosedive late 80s, early 90s. So it might be that the IKEA aesthetic is one of the final nails in the coffin for the small museum. I mean, to some extent we don't know because we don't have any proper data on this, and it might be that lots of new museums are opening up as others close. But I think one of the things it's important to do is to track that change. Hence the importance of the archive. I shall leave it there.
Indeed.
And you can follow us on Twitter or you can look online. Bishopsgate.
I've got the address.
You've got the address. Okay. Let me get out of this PowerPoint and then I'm failing to use this.
Oh, pretty loud enough for the mic, I think.
Is that you?
Oh, that's me. Right, you'll have to excuse my slightly nasal.
Steph, do you want to swap
rubbishness.
places? Because
Should
I
we
don't
swap
think
over?
that will
Yeah,
move.
I'll come over there. I do have that deadly
Don't
man
breathe anywhere
flu,
near me.
so I'll stay well clear from you all. But I get the less interesting part, which is the technical bit about the archive. So if you all want to nod off, you can nod off during my bit. Just to basically, I'm going to cover some ground that Fiona's already covered, just to give you a bit of background. I don't know, any of you know Bishopsgate Institute? Yeah, everyone's nodding. We love that. Well, it looks like it doesn't exactly look like that anymore because that was about 100 years ago, but it's pretty similar. Unfortunately for us, we don't have the largest tobacconist in the world next door anymore. But it's basically been there 120 years, a cultural institute that does courses, lectures, events, and most importantly, a library. Initially a lending library, but in 1897, 2 years after we opened, this gentleman here, who unfortunately you can't see clearly because his moustache is something to quite admire. This gentleman, Charles Goss, started moving us to become a special collections library. He was a working class lad, fanatically interested in collecting stuff about London history, but particularly important for this project maybe as well, not conventional history. He was interested in history from below. Everyday people, what they did. So that he started to build up a collection on London history, particularly from the bottom up about people's history. He also cut his moustache off and left a rather unfortunate Hitler-esque moustache in 1923, but we'll forgive him for that. And now Bishopsgate has carried on gathering collections, and we now have about 250 archive collections, and going on about 300,000 books covering these areas: London history, Labour, socialist history. The co-op, Atheism and Humanism, ironic as we were actually set up by the church across the road from Bishopsgate, but there we go, hopefully they won't mind too much. Protest and campaigning, LGBTQ history, and most importantly for this story, I think, we have the archives of Raphael Samuel and History Workshop. I thought I'd provide a picture of Raphael. Raphael Samuel, we were delighted in 1996 to accept all 700 boxes of his archive. Should say he was a prolific paper keeper would be an understatement. He kept his notes on cigarette papers, restaurant menus, anything he could, and we got it all in 1996 to 1998, and it now lives at Bishopsgate. And he's important for this story. We've heard his name several times from Fiona, because his stuff came to Bishopsgate. He was a regular user of the Institute. He came in, and he was one of the founders of History from Below, one of the champions of History Below in the 1960s, and with a lot of other sort of comrades formed the History Workshop movement, which we now subsequently have had the archive of as well. And his collection is well used there, it fits into themes and has based a lot of the work that we now do at the Institute. Big oral historian, we do a lot of oral history work, and we're very interested in this kind of history from below, grassroots organisation, community activism, and that goes across a lot of their collections. I've been involved in the Raphael Samuel History Centre as well. So imagine my delight one day when I get an email from Dr. Fiona Candlin of Birkbeck College saying I've got an idea about a Micromuseum's collection. This is very Samwellian, should we say. Raphael wrote this book, I think in 94, 95, it was published just before he died in 96.
98.
98.
Out, I think, does it?
I think that's the second one.
Okay.
But this is his real masterwork, and it sort of put forward all his ideas about history being available for everyone, the democratisation of history, everyone's contribution to history really important. As he famously said, history is too important to be left to historians, and he was very keen. Throughout this book, lots and lots of examples of sort of valuing the railway restorer as much as the professor at Oxford University. So we had this here, we had all the notes for this, so when Fiona got in contact, this really fitted in with this ideas of the Micromuseums project with the collections we had already with Raphael Samuel. So I jumped with delight. We met up, sat there for about 3.5 hours looking through the stuff. I made Fiona tell me all the stories about the visits she'd made to the museums, particularly the Museum of Witchcraft was great fun. Do corner her afterwards and ask more about that. And it was great stuff, it was really exciting. Being a fan of this kind of museum as well, when I was young, going to lots of these strange museums, I was very excited about this and realised what a brilliant fit it was. So we took the collection in, about 3 boxes of material to start off with, and then we had how are we going to organise this, how are we going to make this available? So basically, let's get a bit technical. We created a whole new archive, the Micromuseums archive, gave it a unique reference code, MM, which might sound quite sexy, MM. And we based, this archive is going to be added to, and the collection policy that was based around this was one that Fiona had used, that the museums that could be involved and collected from for this project and this archive would be museums that operate without state funding. We went through, we had a wonderful volunteer came in who was doing museum studies at the time.
Yeah, it was one of the students.
One of the students.
Oh no, she was history of art, history of art, but
Yeah.
wanted to go on to be an archivist.
But very, very interesting. She came in and we sat and we went through. We basically piled each museum into a pile, the ephemera, postcards that we could get, and we gave each museum a unique reference code. So for example, a certain museum would become MM1, next one would be MM2. Tried to do it alphabetically, but it doesn't matter so much. And then basically we went through and catalogued each bit of ephemera that had been donated onto our AdLib Archives catalogue. Now AdLib is one of the archive cataloguing softwares that you have, and this would be available to search online. I'll show you a bit more of this in a minute. We also decided to digitise a lot of the stuff to make that available as well, and Sarah, who was the volunteer, sat and digitised and digitised and digitised and remained very sane at the end of it. But she was good by the end. So what does it collect? Most of the stuff that we got donated initially was ephemera that sort of Fiona had picked up. It was leaflets, postcards. But the sort of plan for the archive is really to go a lot further than that and to be almost a complete repository of stuff about micromuseums. So be interested in photos of museums, the leaflets and booklets, which we have good, postcards, posters, but then even more into sort of more archival materials, sort of organisational records of these museums, stuff like collection registers, catalogues, correspondence and visitor books, which hopefully will come, not so much so far, but I think once the archive develops, hopefully that will develop more. So that's basically what we were after. So we were cataloguing away. Should we have the light off for this fascinating look at the Bishopsgate Institute online catalogue? So this is what it looks like. Do go on and enjoy. I'll give you the address later. So basically, all the stuff is now catalogued online. There's about 134 museums. Material is catalogued on here. This is the screen. You can either search it a variety of ways. You can basically just go on witchcraft and you'll find it just by a simple search. But more, if you want to specifically look at the Micromuseums collection online, if you go to our advanced search, select archives at the top, searching, and put MM in the reference code, you will come up with a list of all the museums.
Or actually, if you just go to your nice landing
Which I was going to mention.
Yeah,
I'm trying to get technical.
Sorry.
It's all right.
I just always go the easy way.
You can go the easy way as well, but So basically that gives you a list of all the museums and the stuff we've catalogued so far. Click on each one of those and it will take you into I chose the British Lawnmower Museum, one of my favourites, Southport. You'll go into the description and you'll be able to look at some of the ephemera digitised. At the top you can see sample images of the material that's been collected, and then if you go to the bottom you'll see the excellent descriptions that Sarah did. Leaflet, fact sheet, and dated and number of pages and whether it's open. And then if you want to click on these images as well, you can go in and you can look bigger at these images. So far we've got 134 museums in the archive, but it's quite wonderful because Fiona regularly comes in and brings new piles of stuff.
Quite a lot of new stuff for you.
Yes, and it's always very good. We sit around and go through and get very excited. And some of that, if it's material that we've got in existing museums that are in the archive, we'll add that onto their section in the archive. If it's new ones, we'll create new numbers and add those onto the sequence. A team of volunteers working on the project. Some will be archiving the material, describing, cataloguing the material, some will be digitising. Big plans to contact more museums, add to lists that have been compiled of museums, track stuff down. And we also have some volunteers doing social media, tweeting out bits from the archive, trying to create a bit of a buzz so people might clock onto the archive through that. We're also going to do some events. We've got Fiona coming and talking at the Institute next year. And hopefully there'll also be different kinds of material coming in, some more what we might call classic archives, sort of these visitor books, etc. So it's very exciting. It's building all the time, literally every time Fiona visits, which is great. I won't go on much longer, but just to say you can go on this address, bishopsgate.org Micromuseums, where you can click on one link and instantly get all of the museum hits on the catalogue up. If you just want to have a browse on the catalogue and see what you can find, and then Twitter as well. But just a very sort of slightly dull overview of how the stuff's done on the catalogue. But as I say, it's a wonderful collection. We're absolutely delighted to have it. It fits in with the overall ethos of the Institute and its archives. And long may it rain.
Thank you.
Pleasure.